There is a photograph taken in the desert town of Rancho Mirage, California, that tells you more about the real Frank Sinatra than 100 magazine covers ever could. It is not a glamorous shot. There is no tuxedo, no microphone, no swagger. It is just a grandfather at his kitchen table in Palm Springs reading the morning newspaper with a small girl beside him, and later that same day he would take her out to his art studio and teach her how to hold a paintbrush. The girl called him Pop Pop. The rest of the world called him Old Blue Eyes, the greatest voice of the 20th century. And the astonishing thing is that to his family, the second man barely existed. To them, he was simply the grandfather who wanted everyone around him, all the time. Every weekend he could manage it. That is the Sinatra family that almost nobody talks about. The public knows the legend. The Rat Pack nights, the Vegas residencies, the 4 marriages, the rumored mob connections, the ring-a-ding-ding myth of a man who lived exactly as he pleased. But behind that towering public figure stood an actual family, 3 children, a small handful of grandchildren, and a web of wives and losses and reconciliations. And what happened to all of them, in the decades during and after his life, is a far richer and more human story than the legend ever allowed. Because here is what gets lost beneath the tuxedos and the flashbulbs. Fame on the scale that Frank Sinatra possessed does not stop at the famous person. It radiates outward, into every marriage, every child, every grandchild, warping and shaping the lives of people who never chose the spotlight and never asked for the name. Some of them were crushed by it. Some of them thrived. Some of them spent decades trying to escape it. But not one of them lived an ordinary life, because there was no such thing as ordinary once you carried the name Sinatra. It is a story with tragedy woven right through it. A son kidnapped at gunpoint as a teenager. A daughter who spent her life half in her father's shadow and half building her own fame. A youngest daughter who went to war with her own stepmother over the family's soul. A first wife who loved him for 80 years and never remarried. And a generation of grandchildren who quietly chose art and privacy over the blinding spotlight their grandfather lived under every single day. This is what became of the Sinatra family, from the man himself all the way down to the great-grandchildren who now carry his blood but rarely his name in lights. Let's start where it all began, with the man at the center of it, and the woman who loved him first. The man and the marriages. Frank Sinatra was born in Hoboken, New Jersey, in December of 1915, the only child of Italian immigrant parents, and he clawed his way up from a working-class world of singing waiters and local dance halls to become, arguably, the most famous entertainer alive. But the family story does not really begin with the fame. It begins with a secretary named Nancy Barbato, a plasterer's daughter from Jersey City, whom Frank met at the shore when they were both teenagers and married in 1939, when he was still a nobody with nothing but an outsized belief in his own voice. Nancy was the mother of all 3 of his children, and the foundation of the entire family that followed. She stood by him through the lean early years, raised their family largely on her own as his career exploded, and endured his very public infidelities, most famously his affair with the actress Ava Gardner, for as long as she possibly could. She loved him when he was nobody, when he was a skinny singing waiter with nothing but ambition. And she believed in the voice before there was any reason to. In a life that would eventually be crowded with people who loved him for what he had become, Nancy was the one who had loved him simply for who he was. When she finally granted him a divorce in 1951, she did something remarkable. She never remarried. Not once. Across the rest of her extraordinarily long life. When reporters asked her, decades later, why she had stayed single, she gave an answer that has echoed ever since. After Sinatra, she loved him until the day she died in 2018 at the age of 101, and by every account he never fully stopped loving her either. His daughter Tina later wrote that it took Frank 2 full years even to ask for the divorce, and that they were among the toughest, most insecure years of his life. His career faltering, his money dwindling, what little he had going to Nancy to care for their children. When his own daughter once asked whether, given the chance to do it all again, he would still have left Nancy, Frank reportedly answered with a single word: no. The three marriages that followed each represented a different chapter of his life. Ava Gardner, the fiery Hollywood goddess he married in 1951, was the great tempestuous love of his life. A woman so much his equal in temper and will that their marriage burned itself out within a few years, even as their love for each other quietly endured until her death in 1990. Their union had come at the strangest possible moment during the deepest career slump of Sinatra's life, when his records had stopped selling and his voice had failed him, and it was Ava, the bigger star at the time, who was the breadwinner, and who reportedly helped him land the comeback role that resurrected everything. They loved each other ferociously and fought each other just as hard, and when Ava died, Sinatra was said to be inconsolable, weeping that he should have been there for her. Many who knew him believed she was the one who got away, the woman he measured every other against. Mia Farrow, the delicate young actress 30 years his junior, married him in 1,966 inches, a union that baffled the world and dissolved within 2 years, reportedly over her refusal to abandon her film career for him during the making of Rosemary's Baby, though the two remained friends for the rest of his life. And finally, Barbara Marx, the former showgirl and Marx Brothers' wife, who married him in 1976 and became the woman who stayed, accompanying him through his final 2 decades. Barbara brought a stability to his late life that he had never known. And the two did real charitable good together, founding a children's center for young victims of abuse that Barbara funded in part by having her superstar husband perform concerts. She was the wife who finally lasted, the one who got him to the very end, even as her presence would later become the source of the family's deepest and most lasting rift. Frank Sinatra died on the 14th of May 1998, at the age of 82, of a heart attack. The lights of the Empire State Building were dimmed. The casinos of Las Vegas darkened their marquees. An entire century of American music seemed to pause to mourn him. But he left behind more than a catalogue of immortal songs. He left behind a family, and that family's story was only partly finished. The public tends to remember the myth, the confident, untouchable chairman of the board who ruled Vegas and sang exactly what he wanted. But the man his family knew was more complicated, capable of enormous tenderness and enormous temper, a devoted grandfather one moment and a volatile force the next, a man who could wound the people he loved and then move mountains to make it up to them. Because the 3 children Nancy Barbato had given him were each living lives as complicated, in their own ways, as his own. Let's begin with the eldest, the daughter who became a genuine star while standing right beside the biggest star of all, Nancy Sinatra, the daughter who made her own name. Nancy Sandra Sinatra was born in 1940, the first child, the apple of her father's eye, so beloved that he wrote a song for her, Nancy, with the laughing face. That became a standard in his catalogue. She grew up inside the strange fishbowl of Sinatra fame, and unlike her siblings, she was drawn toward the light rather than away from it. She wanted to perform. Her early recording career went almost nowhere, and there were whispers that the only reason she had a contract at all was her last name. Imagine the difficulty of that. Trying to prove yourself in the one profession your father had already conquered more completely than almost anyone in history, while half the room assumes you are only there because of him. And then, in 1966, everything changed with a single song. Paired with the maverick producer Lee Hazelwood, who told her to stop singing like a sweet young thing and start singing like a woman who had lived, Nancy recorded, "These boots are made for walking." It went to #1 around the world. And it turned her, almost overnight, into a genuine pop icon with an identity entirely her own, cool and defiant and unmistakably not her father. The go-go boots, the blonde hair, the swagger in her voice, none of it belonged to Frank Sinatra. It belonged to her. She followed it with a string of hits, and in 1967 she made history as the first American ever to sing a James Bond theme, "You Only Live Twice." That same year, she recorded a tender duet with her father, "Something Stupid," which went to #1, one of the only father-daughter duets ever to top the charts. Her personal life carried real heartbreak. After a brief first marriage to the teen idol Tommy Sands ended in divorce, Nancy married the choreographer Hugh Lambert in 1970, and by every account, he was the love of her life. They had two daughters together, and Nancy stepped back from her career at the height of her fame to raise them, choosing motherhood over momentum at exactly the moment many performers would have pushed harder. Then Hugh was diagnosed with cancer, and Nancy nursed him until his death in 1985, leaving her a widow at 45 with two young daughters, an eerie echo of what her own mother had endured decades earlier. Like her mother before her, she never remarried. There is a strange, sorrowful symmetry running through the Sinatra women. First Nancy Barbato, then her daughter Nancy, both of them widowed or abandoned by the men they loved, both of them raising their children alone, both of them declining to marry again. In the decades since, Nancy has become one of the most devoted keepers of her father's flame. Now, in her mid-80s, she oversees reissues of his work, shares memories and rare photographs with fans, and hosts radio programming dedicated to his music, a labor of love that has occupied much of her later life. And in a lovely twist, her own recordings from the 1960s have found an entirely new audience, sampled by hip-hop artists, featured in films by directors like Quentin Tarantino, rediscovered by generations who were not even born when she first recorded them. She spent the first half of her life proving she was more than her father's daughter, and she succeeded. And she has spent the second half choosing, freely and lovingly, to honor his memory. Of the three children, hers may be the most balanced legacy of all, an artist who made her own name and then devoted herself, without resentment, to preserving the name she was born with. But if Nancy found a way to live comfortably beside the family fame, her younger brother's relationship with that same name was far more fraught, and it began with one of the most terrifying ordeals any child of a celebrity has ever endured. Frank Sinatra Jr., the son in the shadow, Francis Wayne Sinatra was born in 1944, the only son and the middle child, and from the moment of his birth he carried an almost impossible weight. He was Frank Sinatra's namesake, expected, whether anyone said it aloud or not, to somehow carry forward the most famous voice in the world. He had real musical talent, a fine voice and a deep knowledge of the craft, but no one on earth could have matched what his father was. And so his life became a kind of unwinnable contest against a legend who shared his name and his face. And then, on the night of the 8th of December 1963, when Frank Jr. was just 19 and performing at a lodge in Lake Tahoe, two men forced their way into his room at gunpoint, blindfolded him, and drove him away in the trunk of a car. He had been kidnapped. The ordeal gripped the entire country, coming as it did just weeks after the assassination of President Kennedy, when America already felt like it was coming apart. His father cooperated completely with the amateurish trio of kidnappers, even offering them far more than they asked, and paid a ransom of $240,000. Frank Jr. was released unharmed after roughly 2 days, found walking through an exclusive Los Angeles neighborhood in the early morning hours. The kidnappers were caught within days and convicted. But then came a cruelty that may have wounded him more than the kidnapping itself. At the trial, the defense floated the poisonous theory that the whole thing had been a publicity stunt Frank Jr. arranged to boost his own fledgling career. It was false, and the family vehemently denied it. But the whisper haunted him for years. A second kind of theft that took not his freedom but his dignity. He almost never spoke of the kidnapping again for the rest of his life, apparently determined never to let those 2 days define him. What he did instead was work. For decades, he built a steady career as a singer, and above all, as a conductor and arranger of real skill. And in 1988, he took on the role that would define the rest of his life. His father hired him as his musical director and conductor. For the final decade of Frank Sinatra Sr.'s career, it was his son standing at the podium, leading the orchestra behind the legend, making sure every arrangement was perfect for an aging voice that needed careful support. He knew the material better than almost anyone alive. He knew which keys his father could still reach, when to swell the orchestra, and when to pull it back to a whisper so the old man could find the note. Some saw it as a tragedy, the son reduced to a supporting player in his father's show, the namesake permanently behind the podium while the real Sinatra stood in the light. But by many accounts, Frank Jr. found peace in it. It gave him the sustained closeness with his father he had wanted his whole life, a chance to be genuinely needed, night after night, in a way the scattered visits of his childhood had never allowed. For a boy who had grown up experiencing his father as a distant, dazzling figure, standing beside him on stage for a decade may have been the closest thing to the relationship he had always longed for. He had stopped trying to be Frank Sinatra and found instead a way to be indispensable to him. Frank Sinatra Jr. died on the 16th of March 2016 of cardiac arrest. While on tour in Florida at the age of 72, he passed away fittingly and heartbreakingly on the road, in the middle of a concert engagement, singing the songs that had shaped his entire life. The tributes that followed finally gave him the recognition too often denied him while he lived, an acknowledgement of his real musicianship and his lifetime of dignified service to a legacy that was never quite allowed to be his own. He left behind a son, Michael, who has quietly carried the musical torch forward. If Nancy embraced the family light and Frank Jr. made his uneasy peace with the shadow, the youngest child took a path different from both, stepping almost entirely out of the frame, and then fighting the family's most painful and public battle of all. Tina Sinatra, the daughter who fought for the family. Christina Sinatra, known to everyone as Tina, was born in 1948, the youngest of the three. And in some ways the child shaped most by absence. She was only 3 when her parents divorced, and her earliest memories of her father were of a dazzling visitor who swept in and out again. Unlike her older siblings, Tina had no desire to perform. She gravitated instead to the business side of the industry, working as a producer, becoming the family member most directly involved in managing and protecting her father's professional interests and, eventually, his legacy. Her defining professional achievement came in 1992, when she served as the executive producer of Sinatra, a 5-hour television miniseries about her father's life, an attempt to tell the family's story on the family's own terms, and both a critical and popular success. It was, for Tina, more than a production credit. It was a way of planting a flag, of insisting that the people who had actually lived alongside Frank Sinatra deserved a hand in how his legend was told, rather than leaving it entirely to strangers and tabloids. But the chapter of Tina's life that generated the most attention and the most pain revolved around her father's 4th and final wife, Barbara Marx. In her candid memoir, published in 2000 and titled My Father's Daughter, Tina wrote with real anguish about what she saw as a deliberate effort to isolate her aging father, to drive a wedge between Frank and his children, and to maneuver around questions of his estate and his affairs as his health and his mind declined. It became, by Tina's account, a genuine struggle over access to a dying man and over what would happen to his fortune and legacy after he was gone. There were disputes over money, over property, over who could be close to Frank in his final, vulnerable years. Barbara, for her part, told a very different story in her own book, presenting herself as a devoted wife who cared for Frank faithfully to the end. The two accounts are irreconcilable, and there is no neutral version of the truth. What is beyond dispute is that Frank Sinatra's final years, and their aftermath, were marked by a bitter family conflict that pitted his last wife against his first family, a conflict that in many ways never fully resolved. Strip away the fame, and it is one of the most ordinary and heartbreaking dramas in family life. An aging parent, a second spouse, grown children, and a painful war over money and access at the very end. It plays out in families everywhere. The only difference here was the scale of the fortune and the size of the name at the center of it. In the years since, Tina has largely done what she always seemed to want to do. She stepped back out of the light. She lives quietly in Los Angeles, remaining involved in the stewardship of her father's legacy from a comfortable distance, having said her piece in her memoir, and then, for the most part, fallen silent. Of the 3 children, she is the one who most fully chose privacy, and she has held to that choice with remarkable consistency. There is a certain wisdom in it. Having grown up watching her father's every move dissected by the world, and having lived through the bruising public battle over his final years, She seems to have decided that the most valuable thing her name could buy her was the freedom to stop performing it, to simply live, out of view, on her own terms. 3 children, 3 completely different answers to the same impossible question: what do you do with a father that famous? But the Sinatra story did not end with them. It continued into a third generation, one that watched all of this unfold and drew, almost unanimously, the same quiet conclusion. The grandchildren who chose the quiet life. Frank Sinatra had a small handful of grandchildren, and what is most striking about them, taken together, is how deliberately they stepped away from the spotlight their grandfather lived inside every day of his life. When his estate was settled, each of the grandchildren reportedly received a trust of around $1 million. But what they did with their lives had far less to do with money than with a shared instinct toward privacy and craft. They had all spent childhoods orbiting one of the most famous men on earth, holidays and weekends at his Palm Springs compound, brushes with every celebrity of the age. And rather than being seduced by that world, they seemed to have quietly absorbed a lesson from it, that the fame was the least interesting thing about their grandfather, and that the parts worth keeping were the music, the art, and the fierce closeness of the family itself. Nancy's 2 daughters lead the way. Her elder daughter, Angela Jennifer Lambert, known professionally as A.J. Lambert, followed her mother and grandfather into music, though by her own telling she came up through goth and punk bands before circling back toward the standards her grandfather made immortal. She has released her own collections of songs, performed interpretations of the material connected to her family, and spoken with wry honesty about how surreal it is to be old Blue Eyes' granddaughter. She has shared vivid memories of childhood weekends at her grandfather's Palm Springs estate, where celebrity after celebrity would drift through, and where, as an angsty teenager with a Walkman, she once looked up to find Gregory Peck strolling out under the desert stars. In recent years, she has moved into directing as well, carving out a genuine creative identity of her own, rather than simply trading on the name. Nancy's younger daughter, Amanda, took the quietest path of all. An artist and photographer, she chose a life almost entirely out of the public eye, and she has become one of the most important caretakers of the family's history, spending years preserving her grandfather's personal photographic collection and co-editing a rare, limited edition book of Sinatra photographs. To her, Frank was simply Pop, the grandfather who taught her to paint and to use a camera in his Palm Springs studio, who read the newspaper with her at breakfast, who, in her words, went out of his way every weekend to be surrounded by his children and grandchildren. She has spoken movingly about how much of a family man he was in private, how he simply wanted his people around him, a portrait almost impossible to reconcile with the swaggering public icon. She married her longtime partner, whom she met at 19, has a daughter of her own, and has built exactly the kind of close, private family life that celebrity so rarely allows. Together, Nancy and her 2 daughters and their families represent something genuinely rare in the world of famous dynasties. A clan that chose closeness over fame and meaning over attention. Frank Jr.'s son, Michael Sinatra, carries the musical torch most directly. He became a Las Vegas-based jazz singer, performing the standards of the Rat Pack and the Great American Songbook, keeping his grandfather's and father's sound alive on the very stages where the family legend was built. There is something poignant about it. The grandson of the man who defined that music, singing those same songs in that same city, a living continuation of a sound that shaped the century. Where his father had spent a lifetime laboring in the great man's shadow, Michael seems to have found a way to simply celebrate the music itself, carrying it forward without the crushing weight of being the namesake, one generation removed from the impossible comparison. There is a detail worth pausing on here, because it complicates the tidy picture. After Frank Sinatra Jr.'s death in 2016, a few other individuals reportedly came forward claiming to be his children from earlier relationships, claims that were never publicly confirmed. It is the kind of loose thread that trails behind almost any famous family, a reminder that the full story of a dynasty this large and this private is never entirely knowable from the outside. What is clear is that Michael has been the one to carry the family's music openly into the present, on the same Las Vegas stages that made the Sinatra name synonymous with a whole era of American entertainment. The picture that emerges from this third generation is remarkably consistent. Here was a family that had watched, up close, exactly what unrelenting fame does to a person and to a household: the kidnapping, the tabloids, the estate wars, the impossible pressure of a legendary name. And nearly every one of them responded by choosing the opposite. Privacy, craft, family, a deliberate step back from the blinding light. They kept the music alive. They preserved the photographs. They honored the legacy. But they did it from the wings, not the center stage, where the family stands today. More than a quarter of a century after Frank Sinatra's death, the family he left behind remains bound together by his enormous and complicated legacy, even as each branch of it has settled into a life largely outside the spotlight. Nancy Sinatra, in her mid-80s, endures as the most publicly present of his children, tirelessly preserving her father's music while enjoying a genuine revival of her own, supported closely by her two devoted daughters. Frank Sinatra Jr. is gone, but remembered now more clearly than ever as the serious, gifted musician who spent his life in faithful service to the songbook, with his son Michael carrying that sound forward in Las Vegas. Tina Sinatra lives quietly in Los Angeles, the guardian of one version of the family's story, having chosen privacy over the endless attention her name could command. Of the four wives, only Mia Farrow still lives, the last surviving link to the man himself, having gone on to a remarkable and turbulent life of her own long after their brief marriage ended. A career of acclaimed films, a large family of biological and adopted children, and later a role as a dedicated humanitarian, all of it unfolding in the decades after Sinatra. Nancy Barbato, Ava Gardner, and Barbara Marx have all passed, each of them having left her own permanent mark on the family's story: the first love who never let go, the great fire who got away, and the final wife who stayed to the end. And the grandchildren, and now great-grandchildren, continue the family's quieter traditions, some in music, some in visual art, some entirely out of public view, several of them still connected to the work of preserving and honoring what Frank Sinatra built. Between them, they keep the flame alive, not through spectacle, but through stewardship, the reissues, the archives, the careful protection of a body of work that shows no sign of fading from the culture. The Sinatra name still means something enormous. Frank Sinatra's music is still everywhere, in films, in commercials, in wedding first dances and quiet late-night kitchens, more than a quarter century after his death, as immortal as any American music has ever been. But the people who carry his blood have, almost to a person, chosen to carry it quietly, tending the legacy from the wings while the songs themselves do the work of keeping him alive in the culture. It is a striking arrangement when you think about it. A family that guards one of the most famous names in the world while asking, for themselves, only to be left in peace, what their story leaves behind. When you look back at old footage of Frank Sinatra, the tilted hat, the effortless swagger under the stage lights, the seemingly bottomless confidence, it is tempting to imagine that everyone in his orbit lived at that same dazzling altitude. But the real Sinatra family, the one behind the legend, tells a different and far more human story. It is a story of a man who inspired enormous love and could not always sustain it, who wounded the people closest to him and was, in turn, mourned and cherished by nearly all of them anyway. It is a story of a first wife who loved him for 80 years, of children who each carried the weight of his name in their own way, of a son who survived a kidnapping and made peace with a shadow, of a daughter who became a star and another who fought for the family's soul, and of grandchildren who took one long look at what fame had done and quietly decided they wanted something calmer and truer for themselves. If there is a single thread running through all of it, it is this: Frank Sinatra spent his entire life in front of more cameras and more adoring crowds than almost anyone in the history of American entertainment. And his family, for the most part, spent their lives learning how to live in the enormous space his shadow cast, and then, one by one, quietly stepping out of it, toward privacy, toward craft, toward one another. They kept his music. They kept his memory. But they built their own lives on their own terms, out of the glare. And maybe that is the quiet miracle of the Sinatra family, the thing the legend never quite captures. A man that famous could easily have produced a family of hangers-on, of people who spent their lives feeding off the name, chasing the reflected light, cashing in on the myth. Instead, he produced a daughter who built her own genuine stardom, a son who gave his life to the music itself, another daughter who fought to protect the family's dignity, and a generation of grandchildren who chose the paintbrush and the camera and the quiet family dinner over the marquee. They watched what fame did, up close, in all its glory and all its wreckage, and they chose, almost to a person, to keep the best of it and walk away from the rest. Given everything that name carried, all the glamour and all the grief tangled together, that choice may be the most meaningful legacy the Sinatra family ever left behind. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to our channel so you never miss out on more fascinating stories.